You're watching FJTN, the Federal Judicial Television Network.
Live from the Federal Judicial Center, leading through lessons of experience.
Hi, I'm Bob Luke, Education Specialist with the FJC, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Leading Through Lessons of Experience, where our focus today will be on how managers can draw from their experiences and the experiences of others to develop stories to communicate organizational values and priorities, effective work practices, and lessons learned. We have one 10-minute break scheduled into the program, and as always, I'd like to invite you to send a faxed question to us in the studio using the number that's on your screen. For today's program, we have 4 faculty members who are renowned for their storytelling capabilities and expertise, and they will be telling some of their favorite stories today, talking about how they use stories, how they develop them, when they use stories, and perhaps a couple of words about things to be careful of. Brenda Argoe is clerk for the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of South Carolina. She has been the clerk for 12 years and has been with the courts for 23 years. She is the current chair of the Administrative Office's Bankruptcy Clerks Advisory Group. Terry Deppner is Chief Deputy of Operations for the District and Bankruptcy Court in the Southern District of West Virginia. Terry has been with the courts for 25 years and has been a member of several FJC advisory committees. J. Rich Leonard is the Chief Bankruptcy Judge for the Eastern District of North Carolina. He is also the only bankruptcy judge who serves on the Judicial Conference's Court Administration and Case Management Committee. Our 4th faculty member is Oscar Stephenson, Chief U.S. Probation Officer for the Northern District of Alabama. He has been with the court for 23 years, and he has been a trainer on many FJC programs. So you may be asking yourself, why would managers use stories? For the answers to that question, let's go to our faculty members.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us for what we hope will be a useful or at least an enjoyable 2 hours this afternoon. As managers in our courts, we find that we use stories because they help our staffs understand the core values that underlie our court operations and the behaviors that are expected to respect those values. For instance, it's one thing to say that rehabilitation is a core value of probation. It's entirely another to hear a story about a 2-time drug offender who's assisted by his probation officer in getting a small business administration loan and then is able to set himself up as a barber and ply his trade successfully for 15 years. Stories also help managers in courts get their work done by communicating the way we do things around here, relaying lessons we've learned, and offering advice on how to solve problems and meet challenges. A real benefit of using stories is that we can get our points across without appearing moralistic or overbearing, in contrast to simply relying on policies and directives to make our points be understood. Another reason for using storytelling is that stories engage the listener, engages their intellect, their emotions, and typically in a positive manner. Stories capture a listener's attention, they send a message that's easily remembered, they establish rapport, and build credibility of the information being conveyed.
Storytelling, we want to be sure and point out to you, is not a new communications tool for managers. War stories, for example, are a time-honored example of managerial storytelling. And the after-dinner speech is another familiar forum for storytelling. Many managers and staff use stories daily as they talk to each other about what's going on in the court, what we're dealing with. Sometimes we don't even consciously use the stories, but we do use them to set examples and teach lessons. If we think about it, each one of us can probably recall a story, or maybe more than one, that was told to us by a supervisor, a colleague, a parent, or a child that helped us to do our jobs better. So we first want to take about 10 minutes at your court and let one of two of you Share a story with the others present, and please let it be a story that helped you do your job better. Include in the story who told it to you and what the message was that you took away from the story. And we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Welcome back. I trust that you heard some good stories with important messages. For today's program, we want to focus on crafting the message of a strategic story. And we'll do that by discussing the elements of a strategic story. And you may be wondering what that is. A strategic story has as its primary purpose to communicate an intentional message about appropriate and expected behavior in the courts. For instance, court managers can use strategic stories to let people know how important their work is, to encourage people to do their best in challenging situations, and to explain the rationale for policies and procedures of the court. To give you some examples of what we mean by strategic stories, we'd each like to share with you one of our favorite strategic stories. And we'll introduce each story by describing the message that we're trying to send when we use the story. Rich, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Brenda. Here's a story I like to tell when I want to point out that a conscientious employee making an honest mistake is not the end of the world, and that supervisors will normally work with you in trying to rectify the consequences. I've used this story privately with individuals who are upset because they've made a mistake, and in group settings where there's a complaint about the quality of work being done by others. Years ago, when I was clerk of the district court, there was a major lawsuit brought challenging a hostile takeover attempt of one of the pharmaceutical companies out at Research Triangle Park. And it was of national prominence, with the news truck sitting outside the courthouse. It was assigned to our most experienced and respected judge, who heard arguments all day, and at 3 o'clock announced that the arguments were over and that he would retire to his chambers and dictate an order that would be filed later that afternoon. Newscasters hoped before the 6:30 breaking news. So at 4 o'clock, he comes out of his chambers with the dictation tape in hand, the order completed. Now, as fate would have it, at that particular time, his long-term secretary was on medical leave, and a young deputy clerk from my staff was substituting in her stead. And in the excitement of the moment and in her haste to do a good job, she juggled the dictation tapes in her hand and erased the tape that the judge had just spent the order writing, they just spent the hour dictating this order on. So she breaks into tears, grabs her purse and her coat, goes into his chambers, confesses her error, knows that this is fatal with the court, and says that she's sorry and she's never done anything like this before, but she's going to leave with no complaint. And he sits back, takes a deep breath, and says to his law clerk, "Go tell the lawyers this has taken me longer than I anticipated, and it'll be a while before the order will be filed this afternoon." And turned to my deputy clerk and said, "Now settle yourself down, go take off your coat, put down your purse. We've got a lot of work to do tonight."
So he didn't blame her. That's
We all make mistakes. We all do embarrassing things, and sometimes you want people to know that others have made them before, even serious mistakes, and they've managed to survive. Terry, you've got a story that illustrates this point.
Thank you, Rich. I do. I use this story when I'm talking to supervisors right before we're going in to do an interview, or if we're talking about interview skills. And I use it to underscore the importance of avoiding embarrassing incidences during interviews. I'm the prop lady for this. Don't jump back. I promise I won't shoot you. I pride myself in believing that I have fairly decent interview skills. I want it to put the applicant at ease and hope that I can draw out, a lot of conversation from them during the interview. But you know what they say, pride goeth before a fall, and it certainly did in this instance. But Dan Moore, our deputy in charge in the Huntington Division, and I were interviewing several applicants for an open position. And this one came in the afternoon after several ones. And I can get quite involved in the interviews, wanting to learn as much as we can about the applicants. And I had a rubber band for the most of the day and had wound it around my fingers several times because I'm a hand talker. And had done so, and I guess the rubber band got worn out, and it popped across the room, and it shot the candidate right in the chest.
Oh, my.
And, well, it, of course, startled the candidate, but she recovered really pretty well. But it not only embarrassed myself, because I'm always trying to put forth this, that we're a professional place to work and all of this kind of image, which really blew that. But Dan was biting the bottom of his lip because he was just enjoying my embarrassment, I'm sure. And then to top it off, the candidate said, well, I hope this doesn't mean I don't get the job. Well, she didn't get the job, but I promise you it didn't have anything to do with the rubber band incident. But I don't take rubber bands or anything else that would distract me or others during an interview. 2 interview sessions, you can put it away.
That way if we come to interview, we'll duck when we come in the door.
Yeah. Well, Oscar, don't you have a story for us about a disagreement with a probation officer's recommendation with the
With the judge? Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm.
Terry, one of the important roles we as probation officers have is to make sure that we give very sound and professional recommendations to our judges, because they rely on this in making their decisions. And it's important that people are able to form their own independent recommendation and to stand by it. But there's a time that sometimes officers get so wedded to the recommendation that they lose perspective on what their role is and they forget to remain objective. I had this happen just recently. An officer came to me after a probation revocation hearing, and they had been supervising this person for a period of time and felt like that the violations they had were serious enough to warrant revocation, and they recommended that to the judge. And the judge heard the case and decided not to revoke. Matter of fact, he put the person back under supervision with that officer. So the officer came to me and they were upset and sort of felt like that maybe the court didn't appreciate their work, and I tried to reassure them that I understood how they felt. And one way I did this is to tell a story to them, kind of like Rich was saying earlier, as a way to help them understand. Earlier in my career, I had a situation where I had prepared a pre-sentence report for one of the senior judges in our court, and he was a sort of a living legend among the judges, and he called me up to his chambers, which I was fairly new in, and so I was intimidated, and I went in and sat down with him, and he told me that he appreciated my work, which I was relieved, and that he liked what I had done, but he said, Oscar, in this case, I'm simply not going to be able to go along with your recommendation. And so, I was sort of taken aback. And he said, and he explained, and he said, I know you're not going to like this, but he said, and I don't mind if you disagree with me. He said, as a matter of fact, I don't mind if you even cuss me till you get to the elevators, but then I want you to quit. I didn't cuss him, but I want you to stop and go back to work. I still have my job this time later, but I try to use that to reassure officers that what we do is important, but we have to keep it in perspective. Brenda, I believe you have a story, don't you, about some criteria that you like to use when you're doing this?
Yes, thank you, Oscar. This is a story that I use anytime we're getting ready to introduce a change into our court operations. I use it to remind everyone, and especially myself, that we have to consider everybody who's going to be affected by this change. And this happened near the end of my first year as clerk, and it made a very much a lasting impression on me. But we had used contract court reporters to take the court record for many years, and I started looking into the electronic court recording system. I thought that may be a really good alternative for us, and I read the FJC studies on it, and I talked to other courts, and I talked to my staff, and talked to the judges, and even took one of the judges to a nearby district that used the system so that they could see that it really worked and other judges were comfortable with it. And I was just real proud of doing all my homework. As Terry said, pride goeth before fall. I was real happy with myself. And part of the plan was that once we got all the pieces in place, we were going to invite the bar to come for a demonstration, and we would show them how this new thing was going to work. Well, I failed to take into account 2 things, the rumor mill and the relationship between court reporters and attorneys. So one Friday afternoon, the chief judge and I start getting these hand-delivered letters and telephone calls from irate attorneys who are just certain that we're doing the dumbest thing we've ever done. It's going to affect their clients very negatively. They'll never get another good transcript, and they were just very, very upset. So, of course, that got me upset and frustrated, because I felt like I knew what I was doing. But it dawned on me that maybe I better bring them into this picture early on before we flipped any switches if we wanted it to succeed. So I arranged to go speak at their next monthly meeting. And when I went in, I told them that I felt sort of like Daniel in the lion's den. I thought that might lighten it up, but it didn't. They didn't even think that was funny. But I had a lot of material with me that I shared with them. I gave them a lot of statistics. I told them what the benefits for them would be, and assured them we would do a demonstration and transcripts would be certified and all of those things. So a couple of months later, we did exactly that. We had everything in place. We did the demonstration for the attorneys. We had them role play the part of a judge and a witness and different counsel. And we showed them transcripts that had been done, and we implemented. And that was 12 years ago. They like it. They've never complained about it. It works wonderfully well, and we were really happy with it. But it certainly taught me a lesson, and we use that story sometimes if someone is saying, well, let's change so-and-so, and we say, well, we have to be sure that these people know it, because otherwise you could really get into some trouble. And now we want to go to Rich again, because you've got some more things to tell us.
Thank you, Brenda. The 4 stories you've just heard are examples of the types of stories that court managers can use to motivate, to instruct, and to encourage staff. They all qualify as strategic stories because all happened to real people facing real situations with real consequences. I think you can see how the stories send a fuller, more supportive message than a platitude such as, oh, don't take it personally, or you win some, you lose some, or everybody makes mistakes. This, of course, is not to say that managers should always use stories and that there's no place for policies and directives. We'll talk later in this broadcast about appropriate and inappropriate times for stories. But right now, let's turn our attention to how we develop and tell stories. Developing and telling stories can be reduced to a 6-step process, which you find on pages 7 and 8 of your participant guide. And these are the objectives for today's program. At the end of today's program, you'll be able to identify behavioral messages that can be sent by strategic stories, identify sources for strategic stories, explain the steps for developing a strategic story, identify opportunities for telling a strategic story, describe delivery techniques, and ask questions to solicit feedback on your story's message.
Well, let's talk a bit first about the first objective, identifying a behavioral message that you want to send via a story. You want to give some thought to identifying the message you want to send so that you're clear in your own mind what the intent of your story will be. Examples of messages that can be conveyed by stories are: customer service is our top priority, diversity is valued in this court, or perhaps it might be everyone is expected to pitch in during emergencies. Once you have a message in mind, the next step is to find a story that illustrates your message. Where do you find some stories? Here's where we find some of our stories.
Personal experience is the source of what we refer to as a my story. Personal experience is a very rich source, and some would say is the best sort for these sorts of stories. You know these stories well because they happen to you, and you can tell them with integrity and authenticity and passion. You can draw on your personal experience in the court as the source of these stories, as was the case in the 4 we just told, as well as your experiences outside of the court. For instance, here's one of my favorite personal stories taken from an outside of the court experience. I tell it with new staff particularly to make the point that it's really important to make sure that you've got the correct instructions before you take any action. And if you're not sure, please ask. Those of you who are my friends know that one of the professional highlights of my life is that a couple of times a year I get invited by the State Department to travel abroad and work with emerging judiciaries and new democracies. And in the summer of 1995, I was invited to travel to the African nation of Zambia on such a project. And luckily, I was able to take with me my youngest son, who was 18 and had just finished high school. And even more fortunately, I had discovered that there was a world-famous British anthropologist doing a dig in a remote part of Zambia, and through email, he'd authorized my son to come out with him and join him for a couple of weeks. So we land in Lusaka, and the next morning, my son is whisked away by strangers out into the Zambian bush, which didn't concern me at all because I know my son. But it did concern our ambassador to have this young American lad out in the bush, so he decided we should go out over the weekend and check on him. Now, there was no way to directly contact my son, but there was a phone relay that we could work. So I relayed a message that we'd be coming over the weekend, and he relayed back that that would be fine if I was coming. Would I please bring a birthday cake for 15, art paper and drawing pencils, luggage tags, and chopsticks? I thought it was a bit odd, but I aimed to please, so I scurried all over Lusaka trying to get the requested items, and was particularly proud that I was able to locate the only Chinese restaurant in Zambia and talk to the manager about the importance of the chopsticks to the mission that these young people were involved in. I assumed to pick up small artifacts, and that they desperately needed these, and he gave me 6 sets of his best ivory chopsticks. So Friday comes, and the ambassador and I go out through the bush for 200 miles, and it's a beautiful sunny day. Have a wonderful lunch, tour the dig site, meet the professor, meet all of the other students. My son treats the new British lass he's smitten with to her birthday cake and her presents. The luggage tags are very helpful for tagging all of the bags that are coming out of the dig, but the chopsticks were the glory for the trip for me, and I very proudly bestowed at the end of the meal a set of these chopsticks on each of the participants. And time to go back. I'm very proud of myself and have a last minute with my son, and he says, "Dad, that was great. Thanks for coming, and it's cool to have the ambassador here. But what was that thing you did with the chopsticks?" And I said, "Son, that's what you said. You said bring chopsticks for everyone." And he looked at me and rolled his eyes and says, "Dad, it's 105 degrees out here in the sun in the afternoon. We're dying for chapstick."
Oh. Rich, that is a funny story. But at least you're a good dad. You went extra lengths and got what you thought he wanted. During the time that we were in the process of preparing for this program today, we came to realize that many of my stories that we know and we've been telling come from some meaningful personal experience like Rich just shared with us. And this has some memorable impact on us, and then we file it away sort of in the back of our minds, and then when the time is right, we tell the story. And it seems very natural and very effective. This can be called an intuitive approach. And this is just one way of sort of digging out or trying to find the stories that we all have inside ourselves. There is a more deductive approach to the process, and that basically has 3 parts to it. It's somewhat more structured than the intuitive approach, but you can do this by creating a timeline or focusing on related tasks or related events. When you are creating a timeline, one of the things I think is helpful is to think back over your life, think about the experiences you've had, particularly the memorable ones that maybe helped shape you as a leader and made you what you are today, and then use that as a basis for telling your story. Rich, I believe you have a timeline story you can share with us.
I do, and I use this story to let people know that quality always counts, and particularly in a circumstance where you may have a staff member who's concerned about the time and effort they're putting into a project to get it right, given what they perceive to be the importance of that project. I grew up in a rural farm community in western North Carolina and went to the small high school there, but luckily had a very strong history teacher my junior year. I loved history and had read a lot about historical characters growing up, so it was a good match, and I enjoyed the class. So you can imagine when I got back the first 6 weeks test, I was horrified to learn that I'd gotten a grade of 80, a C, and even more upset when I realized that the history in the exam was perfect, but this teacher had subtracted 5 points for each of the 4 misspelled words that she'd found on my test. And when I went up to her rather belligerently to complain and to point out what I thought was an infallible argument, that this was a history course after all, and I should get an A in history and she should be talking to my English teacher about my spelling difficulties, she looked me square in the eye and she said, "Son, ignorance is ignorance wherever it appears, and my job here is to stamp it out."
I think she did stamp it out.
Well, I used much simpler words in history tests after that.
I made it in history, but I wouldn't want to have her as my teacher, I can tell you that. The second deductive method that we'll share with you has to do with focusing on related tasks. I think this is particularly helpful if you're trying to deal with a subject maybe such as how to develop a team. I think probably at some point in our careers we've all been a part of the teams, or we've known about teams that have been formed. And I think it's important in a situation like this to think about teams and think about the ones who succeeded and even the ones who failed in the process of their formation, and then to focus on those characteristics of successful teams and use that as a basis for your story. The third deductive method for coming up with stories or digging these out is to focus on related events. And I've found that really a good time to do this is when you're going to introduce maybe a major change that's coming about in your court. And if you think back over the former things that have happened, the other changes you've been involved with, and try to think of those that succeeded or again those that failed, and this can provide some real rich material to develop stories. For example, I think y'all probably remember when we all switched from typewriters over to PCs, and that was a major change, very painful change. And then there have been even times when we went from paper docketing to electronic docketing. So if you're confronted with a situation, maybe you're going to introduce electronic case management to your court, and you know there's going to be resistance and people are not going to accept it easily. You can pull on these stories by using this deductive approach of focusing on these related events, and I think that can be an effective way of developing a story to help out with that.
In addition to one's own experiences, another source of stories is other people's stories, especially your staff's stories. You may want to call on one of them in a staff meeting, retreat, or planning session to relate a story of theirs, or tell it yourself, but be sure to give them the proper credit. These are what we refer to as your stories, and Brenda has a your story for us now.
Thanks, Terry. This is a story that our former Chief Judge Bratton Davis told me when I first started working for the court. And it took me a while to realize that he was using this as a lesson, as a teaching form. And those who know Judge Davis would understand and appreciate this also, and Rich certainly knows him. So he's very much the gentleman, always polite, courteous, never rude or abrupt to anyone. And so when he started telling me this story, and after I did get the message, I realized that one of his greatest traits is his ability to get a message across subtly using a story rather than hurting someone's feelings or being direct. But his daughter, when she was in her teens, had an admirer, but the feelings were not mutual. But the daughter, being taught by her father to always be polite, would always try to be polite. So this young man called one summer day, and he wanted her to go out with him that afternoon to the movies. And she said no, she had a very good reason why, and she explained that. So he came over a couple of hours later. He had this casserole dish in his hand, and he had prepared lunch. And he was so proud of himself, and he offered it to the family and told them he hoped they enjoyed it. And of course, they profusely thanked him, and he went away. And so they tasted it, and it just was not edible. So they put the casserole dish down by the back door by Frown's dish, Frown's being the family dog, and thought that, you know, Frown's would take care of this for him. So late that afternoon, the young man comes back, and he came in the house, and everybody starts telling him how good it was and how much they enjoyed it and appreciated it and all these things. And he stood there, and finally he looked at him and said, well, I see Frown's didn't like it. Because what they had forgotten was to check and see whether Frown's would like it. And the young man, came in the back door, and there was the casserole dish, and Frown's hadn't eaten it. And Judge Davis just stopped the story right there. He didn't say anything else. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's just horrible. What on earth did you do? And he said, there's just no lie that fits that situation. And that was the end of it, you know. So it took me, as I said, some time to reflect on it, and I thought, you know, that's a good story, a good message, because sometimes even the very best of us, with the very best intentions, get ourselves in a situation where there's just no lie that's going to fit it. So you just confess it and move on.
Cut you losses.
That's exactly right.
I agree with Judge Davis. He seems to be a very kind and wise man.
And subtle.
Thank you, Brenda, for that story. A third source in developing stories is the organization's history. From the organization's history, you can draw stories intended to reflect the flavor of a court's culture more so than an individual's behavior. These stories are referred to as our stories, and Brenda's up again with an our story.
Well, this is a story that we use to tell anyone when we're getting ready to have a big problem in the court. We run into obstacles getting our work done, and particularly with new staff, we tell this story as hopefully an encouraging one. Around Christmas time in 1992, the Bankr machine started to crash, and those machines in those days were huge, and they took up a whole room, and when they crashed, they really crashed, and it took
It was a real
crash, and it took a long time to restore the database, like 8 hours instead of the hour and a half it does now. And so the system staff was frantic because they would get it up and it would work for an hour and it would crash again. And our systems manager even made a sign for the computer room door, and it said, "In case of fire, wait 1 hour before calling." And we call the AO, and we're begging and pleading and shouting, and they're sending people down and shipping parts in on Delta Express and all these things. And the first few days we thought, well, we'll catch up on our filing and our archiving and cleaning up the house, and so we did that for a couple of days, and we couldn't dock it because the system was down. We finally started sending people home for a few hours a day or even a day on a rotating basis because we didn't have enough for everybody to do. And everybody was thinking, you know, we're getting further and further behind here, and this is going to be a problem. So going into the second week, the chief deputy and I started getting a little nervous because we realized that without docketing the orders, the appeal times weren't running, and we figured judges weren't going to be too happy once they figured that out, and we thought we might better address it before they figured that out. So we thought, all right, we'll go back to manual docketing. Well, the problem was, as Oscar said earlier, we didn't have any typewriters anymore. And we thought, all right, now what? So we created a docket sheet in WordPerfect and put it on the PCs of all the intake and docketing staff. And we got them all together, and we said, we're going to go back to manual docketing. And they kind of gave us this blank stare because only about 4 of us even knew what manual docketing was. And so we sat down and we had a class, and we assured them we'd be right there to do everything we could to help them. And we got it done. We docketed that way for 2 weeks, and before we ever got a machine in that would stay up and keep going. And then the staff said, well, we got to put all this back in to Bankr, so let us just come in on the weekend, we'll get it all in and see how it goes. And we did that, and the system staff was happy with that because they really wanted that machine to get heavily used to see if it would come back and serve us well, which it did, and everything went well, and everybody's life went on, and everyone was real pleased and proud of the way it had been handled. And we haven't had that kind of an obstacle since then, and I'm very thankful for that. But it is a story that's part of our court's culture now, and we use it as an example of a positive staff response to a very serious problem, to let everybody know that when the chips are down, everybody does pitch in and help. And
even on the weekend. So you
right. And it reminds us all that there's always a way, even if it means going backwards to manual docketing for a while. So it serves a lot of purposes. But a fourth source for stories is those that don't come from anyone's experience, but they have a desired message. And these are called parables. They're short, simple stories that don't take place in the court, but they do have a message for the court and a lesson that the court can learn. And Oscar has an example of one of those.
Thank you, Brenda. I do like to use this story when I think it's important that we kind of refocus and get back to our basic mission of what we're for. And I've used this just recently. We had a group of our probation officers who were writers, and they were preparing reports for the court, and we had an FJC program on learning how to write better sentences and clearer paragraphs. And so I was asked to introduce the seminar, and I used this story as saying, okay, this is a basic thing we're doing, and here's a story about a man who had an experience that I think helped remind him of that. This gentleman was a lonely man. He lived by himself, and this had been a few years, and so he decided it was time for some companionship. So he goes to a pet store and he thinks, well, I'll buy a pet and I think this will help me out. And he tells the owner about his dilemma, and the owner listens thoughtfully and he says, well, I have just a pet for you. I have a parrot, and this parrot will talk to you, I guarantee it. So the man thought, well, that seems like a good idea. So he buys the parrot and he goes home and he waits anxiously, and the parrot doesn't say anything. In a few days they elapse and he goes back to the pet store. And he said, well, I'm disappointed. I'm still lonely. You know, my parrot has not spoken a word to me. And the man said, well, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for them to adjust. And I noticed that I sold you that an initial cage. It's sort of a starter cage, but we've got these really new big cages that are coming, of course, more expensive.
Add-ons.
Exactly, add-ons, right. Switch and bait. So bait and switch. So anyway, he gets this large cage and he goes home and he puts his parrot in the large cage and he sits by the cage and waits. Nothing happens. The parrot doesn't say a word. So the man tries to be patient, he waits a few days, goes back to the store, and he said, well, my parrot still has not spoken a word to me. And the owner said, well, I am just really sort of perplexed, because he said normally when the parrot sees themselves in a mirror, they think it's another parrot and they talk. And the man said, I don't have a mirror. And the guy said, oh, I can't believe I didn't sell you a mirror. Well, here's a nice mirror. So the man now invests in the mirror. He spent this additional money. He goes back home, he installs a mirror, he waits, same results. Parrot still won't say a word. So finally he goes back to the store and he said, look, I'm getting really tired of this. You know, I've bought all these things and nothing's worked. And the owner says, well, sir, he said, this is very unusual. I've never had this happen before. And he said, although parrots sometimes, they're in a strange habitat, he said, I have just gotten in this brand new AstroTurf. It looks just like a natural grass. And you put that in the bottom of the cage and that parrot will talk and sing. So the man's excited. He goes home, cleans out the newspaper, puts in this grass. He waits by the cage. A week goes by and the parrot doesn't even say a word. Matter of fact, the parrot dies. So now the man is frustrated. He spent all this money and a dead parrot over his hand. So he goes back to the store. He explains to the man and said, look, I followed every instruction you gave me. I bought the large cage. I put in the mirror, I installed the grass, and nothing happened. And the owner says, I am just totally baffled. He said, that parrot never said one word. And the guy said, well, he said, right with his dying breath, he looked me in the eye and he's really sad. And he said, does that store not sell bird seed? And so I think it's important that we don't forget the basics and the bird seed of what we're trying to do. Good stuff.
Now that you've identified a message you'd like to send and you've come up with several stories that might convey that message, the question is, how do you pick which one? What criteria do you use in selecting a story, Terry?
Well, Reg, I think relevancy is certainly an important criterion. When you're about ready to deliver a speech, you need to consider the audience that you're giving the speech to and that you might be telling the story, their interests, their sensibilities when selecting a story to tell them. Let me give you an example of a story that I told to court reporters that just kind of really bombed. Well, I hate to admit it, but this is supposed to be a learning vehicle here. I used this story as an icebreaker and to facilitate a discussion among court reporters about what to do in the courtroom when something unexpected occurs. I'm sure you have been, not plagued, that's not a really good word, but had to assist a pro se litigant at time who has been persistent. And there is this instance of one particular pro se litigant who went further than the norm and even arrived in the courtroom for a hearing one day. And of course there was the man in the long flowing black robes up on the bench, see the robe part. And then there was the pro se litigant, and there was defense counsel, and there was the court reporter, the courtroom deputy, the whole wide gamut of players in this dignified courtroom proceeding. And this pro se plaintiff was very intuitive, and when he sensed that the proceeding wasn't going to arrive right at his point and in his favor, he broke out into tongues. And speaking in tongues. Oh, wow. And the court reporter looked up helplessly at the judge and said, Judge, stop him. I can't take this down.
That's a great story.
Well, I thought it was a pretty good story, but it bombed. The court reporters didn't laugh. They didn't do anything. And I don't know if it was the content of the story, my delivery. Needless to say, I just don't use that story anymore. It only takes me one time. And so that's what happened.
Well, sometimes a tough audience sort of reminds me of the story you told. Sometimes you just have to go on. There's nothing else to do with that. Yeah.
Well, what criteria do you use, Oscar?
What I found, if a story is going to be believed by your audience, I think it has to be authentic. That is, it has to contain some truthful elements around which you have some personal commitment. And when that occurs, this allows you to tell the story with conviction and with feeling. A story that I like to use, especially with our newer probation officers when we're sort of doing orientation and helping them to appreciate that what they're going to do with offenders that they have under supervision can make an impact and can change people's lives. The story is what I call the Fed ain't no joke. We had a situation in our court a few years ago where we were concerned because so many of our offenders used drugs, and we'd tried different intervention methods and they seemed to have a revolving door. We would try something, they still came back and they were having positives for drug use. And so we formed a group and we got together and decided we were going to have to do something different. So we came up with an intensive 15-day in-house program that our officers run, and we're real proud of the program, and it takes an offender 15 days of 3 weeks of Monday through Friday from 9 until noon, and they meet with our officers, and we use the 12-step philosophy of AA, and we try to teach about drug addiction and also the recovery process. And so the very first group that we had some 5 years ago, I sat in on just to see sort of how it was going to go and how effective I thought it would be. And so about the second week into this process, one of the offenders decided to tell his life story and his experience with the criminal justice system. And he had been in the state system before he came to us, which is not uncommon. But he was explaining to the group that in the federal system, he had found that there was a greater degree of accountability, that we just expected more and we held people to a higher standard. And he said, I'm just going to tell you, in the group, he said, the Fed ain't no joke, and they're serious about that. So, and we hope we are. But he relayed that to the group, and that was sort of the theme for the week. That became sort of our mantra for what we were trying to do. So after the group ended, I lost track with Reggie. And then about 2 years ago, we had a situation where an officer who had been there for a while had retired and had subsequently died, and so several of us went to his funeral. And after the service was over, we were all standing outside the church in a group, and a man came behind me and said in a voice, the Fed ain't no joke. And so I turned around and thought, well, Reggie, you know. And he said, do you remember me? And I said, absolutely, I remember you. And he said, well, I came today because I wanted to pay my respects to this officer. He was the one who referred me to the drug group at your office. And he said, it's had an impact. I'm sober, I have a job, and now I'm out of crime. And so I was real pleased to hear that. And then in January of this year, we had a retirement ceremony for one of our supervisors in the court, and the widow of the officer I talked about earlier came to this ceremony, and after it was over, she and I were visiting a little bit, and I hadn't seen her since the actual funeral of her husband. So I took the opportunity to tell her Reggie's story about how his life had been changed because her husband had referred him to this group. And she looked at me with tears coming down her face and thanked me that I would share this with her about her husband. And she said, well, it just helps me know that he was doing what he was called to do. Mm-hmm. And so I like to use this, trying not to be overly preachy with people, but just to help them know that what we do is important work and it can have life-changing results with that. Brenda, I believe you also have some criteria that you like to use in storytelling.
Right, and one of those is the human interest factor, which is certainly true in the story that you just told. In order to hold and keep the attention of your audience, your stories need both a plot and characters. By plot, I mean the sequence in which actions occur so that the events make up a believable as well as a coherent story. And as you can see from most of the stories that we've told, your story doesn't have to be elaborate or lengthy, but it should include people doing something with real consequences attached to their actions.
Let's take a 10-minute break now, and when we resume, we'll talk about some tips for developing a story and then ask you to develop one. We'll see you in 10.
Welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. Once you've selected your story, the next part of the process is to put it into a tellable form so you can have maximum impact with the audience you're telling the story to. Sometimes when you're trying to develop your stories, you find that it sort of just emerges in your mind rather clearly. Maybe the message there's a strong message that's a part of the story, sort of like Rich, the one you had told earlier about the clerk that made a mistake and yet the judge didn't blame her, and she emerged from that. Or maybe there's a vivid plot to it, like the story about Frowns, the dog in the casserole with that. Or there's engaging characteristics, sort of like Forrest Gump, and we can't forget that one. When this happens in storytelling, this is really great. But what we often find is it's a little more difficult than that. Sometimes you have to spend some additional time and some thought to the story, or maybe you have to elaborate on it. And I think probably most importantly is you have to practice it and tell the story a few times till you're comfortable with it. If you hope to make these stories come alive, we have some pointers for you on pages 7 and 8 of your participant guide that we think will help you to try and develop a story that's sort of right for your audience, that has a beginning to it and a middle and hopefully a good close or an end to it. And when you bring all this together, then you have a very effective strategic story. And Brenda's going to get us started now with the first of these 6 points.
Thanks, Oscar. The first point is your target audience. Just as if it is when you give a speech, you want to know who your audience is so that you can be sure that the message of your story fits their interest. Is your audience a group of new employees? If it is, then an hour story that gives some history of the court is appropriate. It informs them of information they may need, policies they may need, and it does it in a way that is easy to understand. Are you mentoring or perhaps disciplining an employee whose performance you want to improve? If so, a my story or your story could be appropriate as a way of explaining in behavioral terms what kind of improvement you want and also why that improvement is necessary.
Point 2 in storytelling is to have a key message. You may remember we've sort of stressed this, but we think it's so important because this is really what makes the story a strategic story, that is the message to it, rather than just being a story that you're telling maybe to amuse or entertain your audience.
Setting is point 3. Where does the story take place? Details about the setting, such as date, time, location, weather, or season, will up the memorableness factor for your listeners. For instance, the chopsticks chapstick story wouldn't have been as vivid if Rich had just said that he was embarrassed to have mistaken the chopsticks for the chapsticks. But knowing that it took place in the sweltering heat of the African bush helped make us a fuller picture for us of what really happened. And his cohorts at this table wanted to present him with the chopsticks and chapsticks to take place and to remember us by.
Don't
Use them well, Rich.
Using good help.
Thank you. Your role is the 4th point. What's your role in the story? In instances where the message of the story involves something that I've done or that I've learned, I want to convey what I was doing and what effect the story had on me so that I can make sure that the listener understands my message. In a similar vein, you may have noticed that many of the stories that we've told today have a self-deprecating flavor to them, and that's done on purpose. When considering my stories, we think it's important to recall the challenges we've overcome as well as our successes. Admitting your mistakes can not only send a relevant message, but it also humanizes you as a teller. This goes a long way toward building trust and credibility in your listeners.
Other characters is point 5. Who else was in the story? Again, for reasons of clarity and impact, you want to describe who else had a role in the story, what their role was, and how that role was significant for the outcome of the story. For instance, my story about the Bankr machine crashing in our court would have had much less impact had I not included the descriptions of what other people were experiencing and their involvement from both the court staff, the AO people, and everyone else who was in that story.
Brief plot summary is point number 6, and this is the final point. but this is the one that organizes or ties all the other points together, and it helps you to have an effective story. And here are some things you can think about in doing that. First of all, we would recommend that you make a list of the points that you would like to make in your story, that you think then of ways to make these more concise, and finally that you include enough detail so that it's memorable and people can then recall the story. And if you're able to do this, I think your story can be much more effective. We also want to share with you 5 steps that we found that are important when you're trying to construct your plot to the story. First of all, it's essential that you have a beginning to the story. You need a main character that you're going to focus on, like Forrest Gump. You need to have a place and a time and a setting for your story. The second step is, in the story, you need to know that there's going to be some trouble that's going to happen. It's just like this young man that comes back in and sees his casserole, and there's a tension that builds, and you're wondering what Judge Davis is going to do because there's been a mistake made, obviously. And a crisis has occurred in the midst of your story, and you're not sure what the result is going to be. The character has had some failure, and we've all talked about our own failures some today. But the important part of that is that even though you may be embarrassed in this, you survive the process, even after the crisis occurs. And then if it works right, you have some insight or you gain some understanding or lesson, and in the best of circumstances, I think maybe a moral to your story develops. And when that happens, in the 5th point of this is to have affirmation. That is, that lesson you've learned, you never forget it, and you're able then in a similar situation to recall it and use it for a learning experience.
Well, now that you have an overview of what it takes to develop a strategic story, it's your turn. We'd like you to practice developing one for yourselves. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to develop a strategic story of your choosing by referring to the text on how to develop your stories on pages 7 and 8 of your participant guide. Here are some sample messages around which you could develop a story. One might be, customer service is our top priority. Another one might be, diversity is valued in this court. Or maybe, perhaps, everyone is expected to pitch in during emergencies, as Brenda just told us about. Of course, you could identify another message if one comes readily to your mind. But before you start developing your story, please take 5 minutes to form groups of 2 or 3 people and identify a message that each of you in your group agrees is important to the workings of your court, and a specific audience within the court whom you think would benefit from the message. So let's take 5 minutes to, number 1, form groups, number 2, identify a message, and number 3, identify the specific audience for your strategic story. Welcome back. Now I'd like you, in the same group that selected the message and the target audience for your story, to take 15 minutes to develop that story by using the points on pages 7 and 8 of your participant guide. You may not have time to fully develop your story, but please go as far as you can. I'll call on several push-to-talk sites so we can hear a sampling of the stories that have been developed. See you in 15 minutes. Good luck.